The courthouse steps felt like concrete ice beneath my boots as I watched my ex-wife climb them with another man's baby strapped to her chest. 3 months old, according to the custody papers. 3 months since I'd walked out of our marriage and into the hardest truth of my life. Now she wanted child support for a child that wasn't mine, and somehow the state of Arizona thought I owed her a hearing. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same legal system that had married us was now being asked to make me pay for someone else's mistake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus Rivera, and I'm 34 years old. I grew up in Phoenix, where the desert heat teaches you that survival means adaptation and that mirages can fool you if you're not paying attention. I'm a project manager for a construction company that specializes in commercial buildings across the Southwest. My job takes me from job sites in Nevada to office complexes in Colorado, usually 2 weeks at a stretch, sometimes longer when deadlines get tight. I married Stephanie Walsh 4 years ago in a small ceremony at her parents' ranch outside Scottsdale. She was a marketing coordinator for a tech startup, ambitious and sharp, with laugh lines that appeared when she found something genuinely funny, which wasn't often enough. We bought a modest house in Tempe, close enough to both our jobs, but far enough from her mother's daily opinions about how we should be living our lives. I'm not the kind of man who needs the spotlight. I show up early, finish what I start, and keep my word, even when it costs me. My truck is 10 years old but runs clean. My garage has tools that work and a workbench that's seen more weekend projects than I care to count. On Sundays, I call my father in Tucson and listen to him complain about the Cardinals while he pretends he doesn't miss me visiting every weekend. The construction industry runs on trust and schedules. When I tell a client their foundation will be poured on Tuesday, it gets poured on Tuesday, even if it means working through a sandstorm. When I promise a subcontractor their materials will be on site by 7 a.m., they're there at 6:45. In my line of work, your reputation is built one honest day at a time, and it can be destroyed by one careless promise you can't keep. That attention to details served me well in marriage, too. Or so I thought. I noticed when Stephanie changed her coffee order from a simple latte to something complicated with oat milk and extra foam. I noticed when she started wearing perfume to work on Tuesdays and Thursdays specifically. I noticed when her phone started living face down on the kitchen counter, and when she began taking calls in the garage while I was watching television. Construction work means long stretches away from home, living in extended stay hotels that smell like industrial carpet cleaner, and eating dinner from paper containers while you review tomorrow's blueprints. You learn to appreciate the small comforts of routine. A text at lunch, a phone call before bed, photos of the house, the dog, the dinner she made for herself. These things become the threads that hold distance together. But threads can fray when they're pulled too tight or left untended too long. By the 3rd year of our marriage, those texts came later in the day. The phone calls got shorter and more distracted. The photos stopped coming altogether, replaced by generic messages about her being busy with a new campaign launch or working late on a client presentation. I told myself that ambition was attractive, that I'd married an independent woman who didn't need me to hover. I reminded myself that I wasn't exactly available for dinner conversations and weekend errands when I was managing a shopping center construction project 6 hours away. We both had demanding careers. We both understood sacrifice. We both trusted each other to honor the vows we'd made in front of her family and mine. Trust, I learned, can be a luxury you can't afford when the evidence starts piling up like concrete that won't set properly. You can ignore the first crack, explain away the second, but by the third, you're dealing with structural failure. The first crack appeared on a Thursday in October. I'd come home early from a project in Flagstaff because the weather had turned and concrete can't be poured in freezing rain.
I used my key to enter through the front door and called out that I was home.
No answer. Her car was in the driveway and the lights were on, but the house felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with occupancy. I found her laptop open on the kitchen table, screen glowing with what looked like a video call that had been minimized but not ended. The kind of oversight that happens when someone leaves in a hurry. I closed it without looking closer, told myself it was work-related, and went to unpack my bag. When she came home 20 minutes later with grocery bags and an explanation about running to the store, I believed her, because believing was easier than asking questions I wasn't ready to hear answered. The second crack opened 2 weeks later, when I was helping her with her phone, because the screen had cracked and she needed to back up her photos before getting it repaired. As I connected it to her laptop, a notification appeared for a text message from someone named David Chen. The preview showed only the beginning of the message, but it was enough to make my hands pause over the keyboard. Last night was incredible. When can we... The message preview cut off there, and I stood in our kitchen holding her phone like it might explode. She was in the shower, singing off-key the way she did when she thought no one was listening. I could have opened that message thread. I could have scrolled through their history and found whatever truth was waiting there. Instead, I set the phone down and went outside to check the mailbox, as if walking away from evidence could make it disappear. When she came downstairs in her bathrobe, hair wrapped in a towel, I handed her the phone and said the backup was complete. She thanked me and kissed my cheek, and we went to bed like normal people who trusted each other completely. I lay awake until 3 a.m. listening to her breathe and wondering if I was losing my mind or my marriage. The third crack split everything wide open during Thanksgiving week. I was supposed to be in Denver, overseeing the installation of windows in an office building, but the supplier had delivered the wrong specifications and we were delayed until after the holiday. I drove home Tuesday night instead of Friday, planning to surprise her with an early return and maybe recapture some of the connection that had been slipping through our fingers like sand. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway at 9:30 p.m. Her car wasn't there, which wasn't unusual since she often worked late, but something felt different about the darkness. Not just empty, but deliberately vacant. I used my key and called out as I entered, more from habit than expectation. In our bedroom, I found evidence of a hasty departure. Her work clothes were thrown over the chair instead of hung in the closet, her jewelry box was open, and her good earrings were missing. The bathroom counter showed signs of quick makeup application, foundation spilled near the sink, lipstick cap left off the tube. On the nightstand, her charging cable was unplugged and coiled, as if she'd grabbed her phone in a hurry. Next to it lay a hotel key card that definitely wasn't from any of my work trips. The Phoenician Resort, room 412. The kind of place you go for special occasions or when someone else is paying. I sat on the edge of our bed holding that key card and felt something fundamental shift in my chest. Not anger yet, but a cold understanding that the marriage I thought I was living in existed only in my imagination. The real marriage, the one happening while I was laying foundations in other cities, involved hotel rooms and a man named David Chen, and lies told so smoothly they'd become routine. I didn't drive to the hotel. I didn't call her phone or send angry texts. I placed the key card on the kitchen counter where she'd be sure to see it and went to sleep in the guest room. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all, because silence forces truth into the space where excuses used to live. She came home at 6:47 a.m., and I know the exact time because I was awake, drinking coffee at the kitchen table, watching the clock, and waiting for the conversation that would end our marriage. She walked through the front door like she was returning from an early morning jog, which might have been believable if she'd been wearing athletic clothes instead of the black dress she'd worn to her company's holiday party the month before. The key card was still on the counter where I'd left it.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She saw it immediately, and I watched her face cycle through surprise, calculation, and finally resignation. Not shame, which is what I'd expected, but the tired expression of someone who'd been caught carrying a heavy secret and was almost relieved to set it down. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, where we'd eaten thousands of meals and planned our future and argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash. Normal married couple problems that seemed quaint now, like worrying about a leaky faucet when the house is on fire. She told me about David Chen, her company's new creative director who'd been hired 6 months earlier. She told me about late-night strategy sessions that became dinner meetings that became something else entirely. She told me about feelings she hadn't expected and choices she couldn't take back, and how sorry she was that I'd found out this way. What she didn't tell me, because she didn't know yet, was that she was pregnant. I moved out that afternoon, taking only what fit in my truck and leaving everything else for lawyers to divide later. I rented a furnished apartment near my office and tried to build a new routine around the space where my marriage used to be. Work became my sanctuary. Problems I could solve with tools and materials and straightforward engineering principles. 2 months later, she called to tell me about the baby. She was 12 weeks along, which meant the timing aligned perfectly with the hotel key card and the text messages and all the late nights I'd explained away. She wanted to meet for coffee to discuss what this meant for our divorce proceedings. We met at a neutral location, a chain restaurant near the courthouse where the staff was too busy to eavesdrop on personal disasters. She looked tired and thin despite the pregnancy, like someone who'd been making too many difficult decisions without enough sleep. She ordered decaf coffee and picked at a muffin while she explained how complicated everything had become. David Chen, it turned out, was married with 2 children and had no interest in leaving his wife for a woman carrying his child. When Stephanie had told him about the pregnancy, he'd offered to pay for an abortion and disappeared from her life as quickly as he'd entered it. The creative director position had been eliminated the following week, and she'd been asked to train his replacement while working from home until the company decided whether her position was redundant. She needed health insurance. She needed financial stability. She needed someone to help her raise a child that she'd decided to keep despite its father's abandonment. And somehow, in her mind, those needs translated into my responsibility because we were still technically married and Arizona's community property laws were complicated when children were involved. I listened to her explain how we could make it work, how I could be listed as the father on the birth certificate, how we could co-parent amicably, and maybe even reconcile once the baby was born. She painted a picture of redemption and second chances and families that could be rebuilt on new foundations. What she was really asking was for me to claim another man's child and pay for another man's choices, while she pretended that love could be legislated and fatherhood could be assigned by paperwork. I told her I needed time to think about it, paid for her coffee, and drove home to my empty apartment where I could think clearly. I hired a divorce attorney the next morning, a woman named Maria Santos, who specialized in complex family law cases and didn't believe in sugar-coating reality. She explained the legal landscape with the precision of an engineer reading blueprints. Until our divorce was finalized, I could potentially be held responsible for any child born during our marriage, regardless of biological paternity. Arizona law presumes that a husband is the father of any child born to his wife during their marriage, and that presumption can be difficult to overcome without clear evidence and proper legal procedures. The solution was straightforward, but required patience and documentation. We would demand a paternity test as part of the divorce proceedings. We would establish a clear timeline of my work travel and her affair. We would protect my financial assets and ensure that I wasn't legally obligated to support a child that wasn't mine. It should have been simple. Biology doesn't lie, and DNA tests are definitive. I thought we'd file the papers, take the test, and move forward with our separate lives. I underestimated Stephanie's desperation and overestimated her willingness to accept reality. When our court date arrived in February, 3 months after she'd given birth to a daughter she'd named Isabella, Stephanie appeared with a strategy I hadn't anticipated. Instead of quietly accepting the paternity test results that proved I wasn't the father, she was demanding child support based on her claim that I'd accepted financial responsibility for the child during our marriage. Her argument, presented by an attorney who specialized in extracting money from reluctant ex-husbands, was that I'd supported her during the pregnancy, had been present at doctor's appointments, and even helped prepare the nursery in our former home.
Therefore, I'd established a de facto parental relationship that superseded biological paternity, and the court should order me to continue that support regardless of genetics. It was creative legal thinking applied to a relationship that had died the moment I found that hotel key card. But family court operates on different principles than the construction industry.
Sometimes the law is less concerned with what's technically correct than with what serves the best interests of a child who didn't choose to be born into complicated circumstances. I sat in that courthouse corridor waiting for our case to be called, watching Stephanie bounce a baby carrier and adjust blankets like she was performing maternal devotion for an audience. The baby was beautiful, dark-haired like her mother, but with features that clearly belonged to someone else's family line. I felt sorry for the child, who deserved better than being used as a legal weapon in a war between adults. My attorney had prepared me for various outcomes. The judge might order temporary support while paternity was being resolved. He might require mediation before making any financial determinations. He might dismiss Stephanie's claims entirely if he found them legally baseless. What neither of us had anticipated was that this particular judge would have strong opinions about truth, responsibility, and the difference between biology and accountability. Judge Robert Martinez had been on the family court bench for 15 years and had seen every variation of human dysfunction that could be dressed up in legal language and presented as a custody dispute. He was known for cutting through emotional manipulation to focus on facts and for holding people accountable for their choices rather than their circumstances. When our case was called, we filed into a courtroom that smelled like old wood and new carpet, where fluorescent lights hummed like insects, and every sound echoed off walls that had witnessed the dissolution of thousands of families. Stephanie sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney and the baby, who chose that moment to wake up and announce her displeasure with the proceedings. I sat with Maria Santos at the defendant's table, watching the judge review our file while Stephanie attempted to quiet her daughter with the kind of performance that suggested she was more concerned with appearances than actual parenting. The baby's cries filled the courtroom like an accusation, as if even she understood that she was being used as evidence in a case that had nothing to do with her welfare. Judge Martinez looked up from the file and surveyed the scene with the expression of a man who had seen this particular drama too many times. He gestured for Stephanie's attorney to begin her presentation, and what followed was a masterclass in legal fiction disguised as concern for a child's welfare. The attorney painted a picture of a devoted husband who had embraced impending fatherhood, who had attended prenatal appointments and helped choose baby furniture and prepared emotionally and financially for a child he believed was his. She argued that biology was less important than intention, that a man who had willingly assumed the role of father shouldn't be allowed to abandon that responsibility simply because a DNA test revealed inconvenient truths. She presented photos of me at the baby shower that Stephanie's sister had thrown, pictures of me assembling a crib in the spare bedroom, documentation of the health insurance coverage I'd provided during Stephanie's pregnancy. She made it sound like I'd been an eager participant in preparing for fatherhood, rather than a trusting husband who'd been systematically deceived about whose child I was supporting. When she finished her presentation, Judge Martinez turned to my attorney with an expression that suggested he'd already made up his mind about the case, but was willing to hear our side for the sake of completeness. Maria Santos stood and methodically dismantled every argument Stephanie's attorney had made. She presented the timeline of my work travel that coincided with the baby's conception. She introduced evidence of Stephanie's affair, including hotel receipts and phone records that told the story of a relationship that had been going on for months. She provided the DNA test results that definitively proved I wasn't Isabella's biological father. Most importantly, she presented evidence that I had never legally acknowledged paternity and had separated from Stephanie as soon as I learned about her affair, which was before I knew about the pregnancy. Any support I'd provided was based on fraudulent representations about the child's parentage, and I couldn't be held responsible for decisions I'd made while being deliberately deceived. When both attorneys had finished their presentations, Judge Martinez asked Stephanie to stand and address the court directly. What followed was a performance that revealed more about her character than any legal argument could have accomplished. She stood with the baby in her arms and began to cry. Not the honest tears of someone facing difficult circumstances, but the calculated weeping of someone who had learned to use emotion as a tool. She talked about being abandoned by her child's father and facing single motherhood without support. She described the financial hardships of raising a child alone and the importance of providing stability for Isabella's future. What she didn't mention was her choice to continue an affair that destroyed her marriage. She didn't acknowledge the deception that had led to my supporting her pregnancy under false pretenses. She didn't take responsibility for the consequences of her own decisions or show any recognition that her actions had created the situation she was now asking the court to solve. Judge Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at the baby who had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, oblivious to the legal battle being fought over her future. When Stephanie finished speaking, the courtroom fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the whisper of the court reporter's machine. Then Judge Martinez did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including the attorneys who thought they knew how these cases typically ended. He asked me to stand and tell him in my own words what he thought should happen. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 3 months of anger and betrayal and sleepless nights settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I looked at Stephanie, holding a baby who shared none of my genetic material, but all of her manipulation, and I felt something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with clarity. I told Judge Martinez about trust and truth and the difference between being deceived and being responsible. I explained that I'd been prepared to be a father to my own child, but couldn't be expected to pay for another man's choices and another woman's lies. I said that while I felt sorry for Isabella, who deserved better than being born into this mess, compassion couldn't be ordered by a court, and responsibility couldn't be assigned to innocent parties. When I finished speaking, Judge Martinez nodded once and made a note in the file.
Then he looked directly at Stephanie and delivered a verdict that would become the foundation for rebuilding my life on solid ground. Judge Martinez leaned back in his chair and studied the papers in front of him with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that rushing through family court decisions created more problems than they solved. The silence stretched long enough for the baby to shift in Stephanie's arms, making small sounds that echoed off the courtroom walls like whispers of innocence caught in adult warfare. When he finally looked up, his eyes moved from Stephanie to her attorney, then to Maria Santos, and finally settled on me with the weight of 15 years spent untangling the legal messes that people create when they confuse love with possession and responsibility with manipulation. He cleared his throat once, a sound that commanded attention without raising his voice, and began to speak in the measured tone of a man who had seen every variation of this particular story and understood exactly what was at stake. The court has reviewed all evidence presented, including the paternity test results, the timeline of events, and the documentation provided by both parties. The facts are not in dispute. Mr. Rivera is not the biological father of the child in question. The child was conceived during Mrs. Rivera's extramarital relationship with a third party who has refused to acknowledge paternity or provide support. He paused to make a note in the file, and I could hear Stephanie's breathing change rhythm, becoming shallower and more rapid as she realized that her carefully constructed narrative was being dismantled with surgical precision. The court has reviewed all evidence presented, including the paternity test results, the timeline of events, and the documentation provided by both parties. The facts are not in dispute. Mr. Rivera is not the biological father of the child in question.
The child was conceived during Mrs. Rivera's extramarital relationship with a third party who has refused to acknowledge paternity or provide support. Stephanie's attorney leaned forward, preparing to object, but Judge Martinez raised his hand in a gesture that clearly indicated he wasn't finished speaking. However, the evidence shows that Mr. Rivera's support was obtained through deliberate deception. Mrs. Rivera concealed her extramarital relationship and allowed her husband to believe he was supporting his own child. When Mr. Rivera discovered the affair, he immediately separated from his wife and ceased all support. At no point did he voluntarily acknowledge paternity of a child he knew was not his own. The baby started to fuss, and Stephanie began rocking her gently while maintaining the composed expression of someone who still believed she could control the outcome of this proceeding through sheer force of will. I watched her perform motherhood for the judge and felt a familiar mixture of pity and revulsion that had become my default response to her manipulations. Judge Martinez continued his analysis with the methodical precision of an engineer reviewing structural calculations. The court recognizes that this child deserves support and stability. However, that support must come from the appropriate sources. The biological father bears primary responsibility for this child's welfare, and Mrs. Rivera's decision to pursue an extramarital relationship does not transfer that responsibility to an innocent third party. He leaned forward slightly, addressing Stephanie directly for the first time since he'd begun his ruling. Mrs. Rivera, you made choices that resulted in the destruction of your marriage and the birth of a child whose father refuses to acknowledge her. Those choices have consequences that cannot be remedied by forcing your ex-husband to assume responsibilities that are not legally or morally his. The words landed like hammer blows, each one driving deeper into the foundation of Stephanie's case until the entire structure began to collapse. I could see her attorney making notes furiously, probably calculating the chances of a successful appeal, while Stephanie herself seemed to shrink into her chair as if she could disappear from the consequences of her own actions. This court will not order Mr. Rivera to pay child support for a child that is not his. Furthermore, this court finds that Mrs. Rivera's attempt to obtain such support through deception constitutes a form of fraud that undermines the integrity of our family court system.
The silence that followed felt like the moment after a controlled demolition when the dust settles and you can finally see what's left standing. Stephanie's face had gone pale except for two bright spots of color on her cheeks that looked like fever or fury. Her attorney was whispering urgently in her ear, probably explaining the implications of what they'd just heard. I felt Maria Santos's hand briefly touch my shoulder, a gesture of professional satisfaction mixed with genuine relief. We'd known the law was on our side, but family court judges have broad discretion in determining what serves the best interests of children, and sometimes those interests can override strict legal interpretations. Judge Martinez wasn't finished. He consulted his notes again and continued speaking in the same measured tone that had characterized his entire ruling. The court further orders that Mrs. Rivera must pursue child support from the biological father of this child. If she fails to do so within 60 days, this court will initiate contempt proceedings and consider whether her refusal to pursue appropriate support constitutes neglect of her parental duties. This was unexpected territory. Most judges would have simply dismissed Stephanie's claims and moved on to the next case. Judge Martinez was essentially ordering her to confront David Chen legally, forcing her to publicly acknowledge the affair that had destroyed her marriage and demand accountability from the man who had actually created the situation. Stephanie's attorney stood quickly, clearly recognizing that her client was about to receive consequences she hadn't anticipated. Your Honor, my client should not be penalized for the biological father's refusal to acknowledge paternity. She has been abandoned by both men in this situation and is simply trying to provide for her child. Judge Martinez looked at the attorney with the expression of a teacher who had just heard a student make an excuse that demonstrated complete failure to understand the lesson. Counselor, your client was not abandoned by Mr. Rivera. She betrayed him.
There is a significant legal and moral difference between those two circumstances. As for the biological father, your client chose to engage in a relationship with a married man who made it clear he had no interest in the consequences of that relationship. Those choices led directly to her current circumstances. He turned his attention back to Stephanie, who was now crying openly, though whether from genuine emotion or calculated performance remained unclear. Mrs. Rivera, this court sympathizes with the difficulties of single parenthood. However, those difficulties do not justify attempting to force an innocent party to bear financial responsibility for choices they did not make. Your daughter deserves support from her actual father, and this court expects you to pursue that support through appropriate legal channels. The baby had fallen asleep again, her small face peaceful in the midst of the legal storm surrounding her future. I found myself hoping that she would somehow escape the dysfunction that had marked her conception and birth, that she would grow up to make better choices than the adults currently fighting over her welfare. Judge Martinez made several more notes in the file before delivering the final portion of his ruling. This court hereby grants the divorce between Marcus Rivera and Stephanie Walsh Rivera. All marital assets will be divided according to Arizona community property laws, with the exception that Mr. Rivera will retain sole ownership of any assets acquired after the date of separation. Mrs. Rivera will receive no spousal support, as the dissolution of this marriage was caused by her adultery. He paused to let that sink in before continuing. Mr. Rivera is ordered to pay no child support for the minor child Isabella Walsh, as he is not the biological father and has not voluntarily acknowledged paternity. Mrs. Rivera is ordered to remove Mr. Rivera's name from any birth certificates or legal documents that incorrectly identify him as the father of this child. The relief that washed over me felt like stepping out of a construction site at the end of a particularly brutal day, when your back aches and your hands are raw, but you've built something solid that will last. 3 months of legal uncertainty had just been resolved in my favor, and I could finally begin the process of rebuilding my life on a foundation that wasn't undermined by someone else's lies. Stephanie's attorney requested permission to approach the bench, probably to discuss appeal options or request a delay in implementing the court's orders. Judge Martinez waved her forward, and they conducted a brief, whispered conversation that ended with the attorney returning to her table, looking defeated.
When court was adjourned, I walked out of that building feeling lighter than I had since the morning I'd found the hotel keycard on our nightstand. The Arizona sun felt warmer on my face, and the traffic noise sounded less oppressive than it had on the way into the courthouse. Maria Santos walked beside me, explaining the next steps in finalizing the divorce and ensuring that all court orders were properly implemented. But my attention was focused on the future rather than the legal details. For the first time in months, I could think about tomorrow without wondering what new complications Stephanie might create or what financial obligations might be imposed on me for choices I hadn't made. The construction business had taught me that the most important part of any project happens after the demolition is complete. You can't build something new until you've cleared away everything that's broken or unstable. That afternoon, as I drove back to my apartment, I felt like I'd finally finished the demolition phase of my personal reconstruction project. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into work with the focused energy of a man who no longer had to divide his attention between building structures and defending against legal attacks. There was a shopping center project in Tucson that needed an experienced project manager, and I volunteered for the assignment even though it meant longer hours and more travel. The work was straightforward and honest. Materials arrived on schedule or they didn't. Concrete set properly or it had to be torn out and replaced. Contractors showed up when they promised or they were replaced with people who honored their commitments. Everything operated according to clear rules and measurable standards, which felt like a vacation from the arbitrary emotional manipulations that had characterized my marriage. My father was pleased to have me working closer to home again. We developed a routine of meeting for breakfast on Saturday mornings at a diner near his house, where we discussed the Cardinals' prospects and the state of the construction industry while carefully avoiding any mention of divorce proceedings or court orders. He was old school in his approach to personal problems. You handled your business privately. You didn't burden other people with your troubles, and you moved forward without dwelling on what couldn't be changed. I appreciated his restraint during those Saturday morning conversations. the way he asked about my work and my health without prying into the details of my personal life. One morning in late March, he broke his usual pattern by asking directly about my plans for the future. Not about work projects or housing arrangements, but about whether I intended to stay in Arizona or consider relocating somewhere with fewer painful associations. The question caught me off guard because I hadn't realized I'd been considering leaving until he asked. Phoenix held too many memories of the life I'd thought I was building with Stephanie. The house we'd shared, the restaurants where we'd celebrated anniversaries, the grocery stores where we'd argued about dinner plans and weekend activities. Every familiar location carried the weight of 4 years' worth of shared experiences that had been retroactively poisoned by the knowledge of her deception. But leaving would mean abandoning the professional relationships I'd spent years developing, the network of contractors and suppliers who trusted my work and recommended me for new projects. It would mean starting over in a new market, where I'd have to prove myself all over again, where my reputation would be unknown and my word would need to be tested before it was valued. I told my father I was thinking about it, but hadn't made any decisions yet. He nodded and changed the subject to safer ground, but I could tell the question had been weighing on his mind for weeks. He understood, better than most people, that sometimes a man needs to leave familiar territory in order to heal properly. The answer came unexpectedly the following week, when I received a call from a construction company in Colorado that specialized in mountain resort development. They'd heard about my work through industry contacts and were looking for a project manager to oversee the construction of a luxury hotel complex near Vail. It was exactly the kind of challenge I'd been craving. Complicated engineering requirements, tight deadlines, demanding clients, and the opportunity to work in an environment where the air was clean and the mountains reminded you daily that human problems were temporary while natural beauty was permanent. I drove up to Colorado for the interview and fell in love with the landscape before I'd even met with the company executives. The roads wound through valleys where snow-capped peaks reflected in clear lakes, where the silence was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat, where the scale of the natural world put human drama into proper perspective. The interview went well. The company was impressed with my experience and my willingness to relocate for the project. They offered me a salary increase and a benefits package that included housing assistance and moving expenses. Most importantly, they offered me the chance to build something beautiful in a place where my past couldn't follow me. I accepted the position that afternoon and drove back to Phoenix with a plan for the next chapter of my life. 2 weeks later, I was loading my belongings into a moving truck while my father supervised the process with the careful attention of a man who understood that some departures were necessary for survival. The apartment in Phoenix had never felt like home anyway. It had been a temporary shelter while I waited for the legal system to resolve my situation and determine my obligations. Now that those questions had been answered definitively, I could move forward without looking over my shoulder for process servers or court summons.
My father helped me load the last boxes into the truck and then stood in the empty apartment looking around at the bare walls and clean carpet with the expression of a man who was proud of his son's resilience but sorry that it had been necessary. "You did the right thing," he said finally. "Not just in court, but in how you handled all of it. A lot of men would have gotten angry and done something stupid." I thanked him and promised to call regularly and visit whenever work schedules allowed. We shook hands like business partners, concluding a successful deal, both of us understanding that this departure was about building a future rather than running from the past. The drive to Colorado took 8 hours through desert landscapes that gradually gave way to pine forests and mountain meadows. I stopped for lunch in Flagstaff and realized that this was the first time in months that I'd eaten a meal without thinking about legal strategies or court dates or financial obligations to children who weren't mine. The hotel project was everything the company had promised and more challenging than I'd expected. The site was located at 8,000 feet above sea level, where weather conditions could change from sunny to snowy in a matter of hours, and where every delivery had to be scheduled around mountain roads that became impossible during winter storms.
The construction crew was a mixture of local craftsmen who understood mountain building techniques and imported specialists who brought expertise in luxury hotel amenities. Managing the coordination between these different groups required diplomatic skills I'd never needed on flatland commercial projects. But the work was satisfying in ways that went beyond professional accomplishment. Every morning I drove to a job site surrounded by peaks that caught the sunrise like cathedral spires. Every evening I watched sunset paint the mountains in colors that photography couldn't capture, and artists spent lifetimes trying to reproduce. The physical demands of high-altitude construction work helped me sleep better than I had in years. The mental challenges of solving engineering problems in difficult terrain left me too tired to dwell on the marriage that had failed or the woman who had betrayed my trust. Slowly, over the course of that spring and summer, I began to rediscover parts of myself that had been submerged during the years of long-distance marriage and gradual deception. I remembered that I enjoyed hiking and camping, activities that Stephanie had always found too uncomfortable or inconvenient. I rediscovered my appreciation for classical music and read books that had nothing to do with construction techniques or project management. Most importantly, I learned to enjoy solitude without feeling lonely. The mountain environment taught me the difference between being alone and being isolated, between independence and abandonment. Some evenings I would sit on the deck of my rented cabin and listen to the silence broken only by wind through pine trees and the occasional call of an owl or coyote. These moments of peace felt like a form of healing that couldn't be achieved through legal victories or financial settlements. The mountains didn't care about my divorce or my ex-wife's deception or the child support case that had been dismissed by an Arizona judge. They offered a perspective that made human problems seem temporary and manageable. By autumn, when the aspen trees turned gold and the first snow dusted the higher peaks, I realized that I was happy in a way I hadn't been for years. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince himself that everything was fine, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who had rebuilt his life on solid ground and was comfortable with the foundation he'd created. The hotel project was ahead of schedule and under budget, which earned me recognition from the company executives and invitations to bid on future projects throughout the Rocky Mountain region. My reputation was being rebuilt on merit rather than history, which felt like the ultimate vindication of my decision to leave Arizona and start fresh. I called my father regularly to update him on my progress and listen to his complaints about the Cardinals' latest losses. He sounded proud of what I'd accomplished, though he expressed it in the understated way that characterized his generation's approach to emotional communication. During one of these conversations in October, he mentioned that he'd heard news about Stephanie through mutual acquaintances. She had indeed pursued child support from David Chen, as Judge Martinez had ordered, but the legal process had been complicated by Chen's attempts to avoid service and his wife's discovery of the affair. The resulting scandal had cost Chen his marriage and his career, as his wife had filed for divorce and his employer had terminated his position for conduct that reflected poorly on the company's reputation. Stephanie had eventually received a court order for child support, but collecting payments from an unemployed man with his own legal troubles had proven difficult. My father delivered this information without editorial comment, simply reporting facts as he'd heard them. I listened without either satisfaction or sympathy. Stephanie's difficulties were the natural consequences of choices she had made, and Chen's downfall was the result of his own decisions about infidelity and responsibility. What struck me most about hearing this news was how detached I felt from it. 6 months ago, any information about Stephanie would have triggered a complex emotional response involving anger, hurt, and bitter satisfaction. Now it felt like hearing about strangers whose problems had nothing to do with my daily life. That emotional distance felt like proof that I'd successfully completed the reconstruction project I'd begun when I walked out of that Arizona courthouse. I'd demolished the damaged foundation of my old life and built something new that could withstand whatever storms might come. The holiday season approached with none of the anxiety that had characterized previous years. I didn't have to navigate complicated family dynamics or pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't.
I didn't have to buy gifts for someone who might be planning to leave, or worry about whose family we'd visit for which celebration. Instead, I planned a quiet Christmas in the mountains, where I could ski during the day and read by a fireplace in the evening. I invited my father to visit if he wanted to experience a white Christmas, but I was equally content with the prospect of spending the holiday alone with my thoughts and the mountain silence. The invitation surprised him, I think because it represented a level of personal peace that he hadn't expected me to achieve so quickly. But he accepted, and we spent a week together in December exploring mountain trails and discussing everything except the marriage that had brought me to Colorado in the first place. On Christmas morning, as we drank coffee and watched snowfall outside the cabin windows, he told me he was proud of how I'd handled the entire situation. Not just the legal aspects, but the way I'd refused to let anger poison my future or bitterness define my character. That conversation became one of the most important gifts I received that year, not because I needed his approval, but because his perspective helped me understand that I'd accomplished something more significant than simply winning a court case or escaping financial obligation. I'd learned to distinguish between justice and revenge, between protecting myself and punishing others. I'd chosen to build rather than destroy, to move forward rather than remain trapped in resentment. Most importantly, I'd discovered that healing was possible without forgiveness, that you could recover from betrayal without pretending it hadn't happened. As winter turned to spring and the hotel project neared completion, I began considering my options for the future. The construction company had offered me a permanent position overseeing multiple projects throughout the region. Other companies had expressed interest in my services based on the reputation I'd built during the hotel construction. But for the first time in years, I had the luxury of making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what circumstances demanded. I could choose projects based on their appeal rather than their financial necessity. I could select locations based on their beauty rather than their convenience to a marriage that no longer existed. The mountains had taught me that some foundations are worth building on, and others need to be abandoned entirely. I'd learned the difference between renovation and reconstruction, between repairing what's damaged and starting fresh with better materials. As I looked ahead to whatever challenges and opportunities might come, I felt confident that I'd built something solid enough to support whatever future I chose to construct. The legal victory in Arizona had been important, but the personal victory in Colorado was what would sustain me for years to come. 2 years had passed since I'd walked out of that Arizona courthouse, and I was standing in the lobby of the Silverwood Resort watching the final inspections of a project that had transformed both the mountain landscape and my understanding of what I could accomplish when I wasn't fighting other people's battles. The hotel had opened 3 months ahead of schedule and was already booked solid through the following winter season. Travel magazines were calling it an architectural masterpiece that blended luxury amenities with respect for the natural environment. The construction industry trade publications were featuring it as an example of how complex mountain projects could be completed on time and under budget when managed by experienced professionals. But what satisfied me most was simpler than industry recognition or professional accolades. I had built something beautiful and permanent in a place where the mountains reminded me daily that human achievements, no matter how impressive, were temporary compared to the natural world that surrounded them. Standing in that lobby, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that framed snow-covered peaks, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from completing work that matters. Not just because it generated revenue or enhanced my reputation, but because it would provide meaningful experiences for thousands of visitors over the coming decades. My phone buzzed with a text from my father asking about my plans for Thanksgiving. He'd been hinting for weeks that he was considering moving to Colorado himself, drawn by the clean air and the proximity to his son's new life. At 72, he was still healthy and active enough to appreciate mountain living, and I'd been encouraging him to make the transition while he could still enjoy it fully. The idea of having family nearby appealed to me in ways I hadn't expected. For 2 years, I'd been rebuilding my life in deliberate isolation, focusing on work and personal healing without the complications of close relationships or emotional obligations. It had been necessary medicine for wounds that needed time and space to heal properly. But isolation, like any medicine, could become harmful if continued past its useful period. I was ready for the next phase of reconstruction, which would involve opening my life to new connections and possibilities while maintaining the hard-won peace I'd discovered in the mountains. The hotel's grand opening celebration was scheduled for the following evening, and I'd been invited to attend as the guest of honor. The company executives wanted to showcase their project manager to potential clients and industry contacts, which meant speeches and networking and the kind of professional performance that I'd learned to handle competently without particularly enjoying. I was adjusting my tie in the mirror of my hotel room when I received an unexpected phone call from Maria Santos, my divorce attorney in Arizona. We hadn't spoken in over a year, not since the final paperwork had been filed and all legal obligations had been formally terminated. Her voice carried the professional warmth I remembered, but there was something else underneath it that suggested this wasn't a routine check-in call. She asked about my new life in Colorado and expressed genuine pleasure at hearing about my professional success and personal contentment. Then she explained the reason for her call. Stephanie had contacted her office the previous week, asking about the possibility of reopening the child support case, not based on new evidence or changed circumstances, but on a different legal theory that she'd discovered through internet research and desperation.
Apparently, Stephanie had learned about something called presumptive paternity, which could potentially establish parental obligations based on marriage timing rather than biological facts. Her new attorney, the third one she'd hired since our court appearance, was arguing that Arizona law created an irrebuttable presumption of paternity for children born during marriage, regardless of DNA evidence. Maria Santos was calling to give me advance notice that papers might be filed, though she emphasized that this new legal theory was likely to be unsuccessful given the specific facts of our case and the clear ruling from Judge Martinez. Still, it would require a response and possibly another court appearance to definitively resolve. I listened to her explanation while watching snowfall outside my hotel window, feeling remarkably calm about news that would have triggered anxiety and anger 2 years earlier. The distance wasn't just geographical, it was emotional and psychological. Stephanie's continued attempts to make her problems my responsibility felt like weather reports from a distant climate that no longer affected my daily life. I told Maria Santos to handle whatever legal response was necessary and to keep me informed of any developments that required my attention. I authorized her to take whatever steps were needed to protect my interests, including filing for sanctions against Stephanie and her attorney if their new claims were found to be frivolous. But mostly, I felt grateful for the perspective that 2 years of mountain living had provided. Stephanie's desperation to solve her financial problems through legal manipulation said more about her character than any court ruling could establish. The fact that she was still trying to entangle me in consequences of choices I hadn't made demonstrated that she'd learned nothing from the clear boundaries Judge Martinez had established. After hanging up with Maria Santos, I considered calling my father to update him on this latest development, but I decided against it, not because I wanted to hide the information, but because it didn't seem important enough to interrupt his evening. That realization felt like another marker of how completely I'd moved beyond the marriage that had once defined my daily existence. The grand opening celebration exceeded everyone's expectations. The hotel's ballroom was filled with industry executives, potential investors, local officials, and travel writers who'd flown in from major cities to experience the mountain luxury that had been generating advance publicity for months. I found myself genuinely enjoying the conversations with other construction professionals who were interested in the technical challenges we'd overcome during the building process. These were substantive discussions about engineering solutions and project management techniques, not small talk or social posturing. During the formal presentation, the company president introduced me as the project manager who delivered an impossible timeline while maintaining uncompromising quality standards. The applause was gratifying, but what meant more was the respect I could see in the faces of colleagues who understood exactly what had been accomplished. After the speeches, I was approached by representatives from several other construction companies who were interested in discussing future projects. Mountain resort development was apparently experiencing unprecedented growth, driven by wealthy clients who wanted luxury accommodations in spectacular natural settings. One conversation in particular caught my attention.
A development company from Montana was planning an eco-friendly ski resort that would incorporate the latest sustainable building technologies while providing amenities that could compete with traditional luxury destinations. The project would require someone with experience in high-altitude construction and the ability to coordinate multiple specialty contractors while maintaining environmental compliance. It was exactly the kind of challenge that appealed to me. Complex enough to be interesting, but clearly defined enough to be manageable. We exchanged contact information and agreed to continue discussions after the holidays. The timeline would allow me to complete my current commitments while giving me something substantial to look forward to in the new year. As the evening wound down, I stepped outside onto the hotel's main terrace to appreciate the view that had inspired the entire project. The mountains rose like cathedral spires against a star-filled sky, their snow-covered peaks reflecting moonlight in a display that no architect could improve upon. Standing there in the crisp mountain air, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd been sitting in a courthouse, waiting to learn whether I'd be financially responsible for another man's child. Tonight, I was being celebrated for professional achievements that had exceeded my own expectations. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had required daily choices to focus on building rather than dwelling on destruction, to invest energy in possibilities rather than grievances, to measure progress by personal growth rather than by someone else's failures. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, which usually meant spam or misdirected communication, but when I checked it, I found a brief note from someone who identified herself as David Chen's ex-wife. She'd heard about my situation through mutual acquaintances and wanted me to know that she respected how I had handled the aftermath of discovering the affair. Her own divorce had been finalized recently, and she was working to rebuild her life with her 2 children while pursuing child support from her ex-husband. She didn't ask for advice or assistance, just wanted to acknowledge that she understood the particular challenges of being betrayed by someone you trusted completely. Her message ended with a simple statement that resonated more than elaborate expressions of sympathy might have. Sometimes, the best revenge is living well. I typed a brief response, wishing her success in her own reconstruction project, and deleted the conversation thread. Some connections, however sincere, were better left as single exchanges rather than ongoing relationships that might complicate the clean boundaries I had established around my past. The following morning brought news that provided perfect closure to the legal complications that had followed me from Arizona. Maria Santos called to report that Stephanie's latest legal gambit had been dismissed even more decisively than her original child support claim.
Judge Martinez had not only rejected the presumptive paternity argument, but had issued sanctions against Stephanie and her attorney for filing frivolous claims that wasted court resources and attempted to relitigate issues that had been definitively resolved. The sanctions included financial penalties and a prohibition against filing any future claims related to our marriage or divorce without specific court permission. More significantly, the judge had ordered Stephanie to undergo counseling to address what he characterized as her pattern of using the legal system to avoid accepting responsibility for her own choices. The court would monitor her compliance with this requirement and could impose additional penalties if she failed to complete the mandated sessions. Maria Santos explained that this type of comprehensive sanctions order was unusual but reflected Judge Martinez's frustration with repeat litigants who attempted to manipulate the family court system. My case had apparently become a precedent for how to handle similar situations in the future. I felt a profound sense of finality that had nothing to do with legal victory and everything to do with confirmed closure. The chapter of my life that had been defined by Stephanie's deceptions and manipulations was now officially concluded, with court orders that prevented any future attempts to drag me back into dramas I hadn't created. That afternoon, I drove to my father's house in Tucson to share the news and discuss his potential move to Colorado. The desert landscape that had once felt like home now seemed harsh and uninviting compared to the mountain environment where I had discovered peace and purpose. My father listened to the legal update with the satisfaction of a man who'd always believed that persistence and principle would eventually prevail over manipulation and entitlement. He was particularly pleased to hear that Judge Martinez had imposed consequences that might prevent Stephanie from creating similar problems for other people in the future. We spent the evening reviewing real estate listings for properties near my Colorado base, discussing the practical aspects of relocating at his age while acknowledging the emotional benefits of being closer to family. He was clearly excited about the prospect of mountain living, though he tried to downplay his enthusiasm in the understated way that characterized his generation's approach to major life changes. By the time I drove back to Colorado the following week, I'd identified several properties that met his criteria for accessibility, affordability, and proximity to medical facilities. He planned to visit during the spring to evaluate his options firsthand and make a final decision about whether the move made sense for his circumstances. The Montana project materialized into a formal offer that exceeded my expectations in terms of both financial compensation and creative challenge. The resort would be built in a pristine valley that had never been developed, requiring innovative solutions to minimize environmental impact while maximizing guest experience. I accepted the position and began the process of transitioning my responsibilities for the Colorado hotel to the company's permanent management team. It felt natural to move on to new challenges rather than becoming complacent about past successes, and I was eager to apply the lessons I'd learned to an even more ambitious project. Spring arrived early in the mountains that year, with wildflowers blooming in meadows that had been covered by snow just weeks earlier. The transition felt symbolic of the broader changes in my life, as if the natural world was confirming that renewal was not only possible, but inevitable for those willing to embrace it. I spent my final weeks in Colorado hiking trails I'd discovered during my 2 years there, saying goodbye to landscapes that had provided healing and perspective when I'd needed them most. The mountains had taught me that strength came from solid foundations, and that beauty was worth building carefully even when the process required patience and precision. On my last evening, I returned to the hotel terrace where I'd reflected on my journey during the grand opening celebration. The view was exactly the same, but my relationship to it had evolved from desperate gratitude to confident appreciation. I was no longer a refugee from a failed marriage seeking shelter in mountain solitude. I was a professional who'd chosen to build his career in spectacular locations because he could. The difference mattered more than I would have expected 2 years ago. It represented the completion of an internal reconstruction project that had been more important than any building I'd managed or any legal victory I'd achieved. As I prepared to leave for Montana and the next chapter of my professional life, I felt ready for whatever challenges and opportunities might arise. I'd learned to distinguish between problems I could solve and problems that belonged to other people. I discovered that healing was possible without forgiveness and that moving forward didn't require understanding why other people made destructive choices. Most importantly, I'd rebuilt my life on principles that couldn't be shaken by other people's deceptions or manipulations. Trust, once lost, might not be fully restored, but self-respect could be reconstructed stronger than before if you were willing to do the work honestly and completely. The mountains had taught me that some storms pass quickly, while others require you to hunker down and wait them out. But they'd also taught me that clear skies always return eventually, and that the view from high ground is worth whatever effort it takes to get there. 6 months later, I was standing in another mountain valley, watching the foundation being poured for a resort that would set new standards for sustainable luxury development. My father had successfully relocated to a house 20 minutes from my worksite, where he spent his mornings reading on a deck that overlooked the same peaks that I could see from my office window. Stephanie's name occasionally appeared in my thoughts, usually triggered by anniversary dates or legal documents that needed to be filed. But those moments passed quickly, like weather that moves through without leaving lasting effects. She'd become a character from a story I'd once lived but no longer inhabited. The child, Isabella, would be walking now, probably saying her first words and beginning to explore the world with the innocent curiosity that children possess before they learn that adults sometimes make choices that complicate everything unnecessarily. I hope she would grow up surrounded by stability and honesty, qualities that her mother had struggled to provide, but that she deserved nonetheless. David Chen's career had apparently recovered somewhat, though he relocated to a different city and a different industry after the scandal destroyed his reputation in Phoenix. Whether he was providing consistent support for his daughter remained unclear, but that was no longer my concern or responsibility. What mattered was that I'd successfully separated my well-being from their ongoing drama.
that I'd built a life that generated satisfaction and meaning independent of how their story concluded.
The legal system had protected my interests, but I'd protected my future by choosing construction over destruction, growth over resentment, and possibilities over grievances. Standing in that Montana valley, surrounded by peaks that made human problems seem temporary and manageable, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this place of professional accomplishment and personal peace. The betrayal that had once threatened to define my future had instead become the catalyst for rebuilding my life on stronger foundations than I'd ever imagined possible. The Montana project consumed my attention for the next 18 months, each day bringing new challenges that required creative solutions and careful coordination between environmental protection agencies and luxury hospitality expectations. The resort was being built in a valley that had been untouched by commercial development, which meant every decision had to balance guest experience with ecological preservation. Working at that altitude, nearly 9,000 feet above sea level, demanded physical conditioning that I'd never needed for desert construction projects. The air was thin enough that simple tasks like carrying materials or climbing scaffolding left me breathless until my body adapted to the reduced oxygen levels. But the discomfort was temporary, and the reward was working in an environment where every morning brought views that photographs couldn't capture and artists spent careers trying to reproduce. My father had settled into mountain life with the enthusiasm of a man who discovered that his final chapter could be his most fulfilling. He'd joined a hiking group for seniors, learned to identify local wildlife, and started volunteering at the regional hospital where his decades of practical experience proved valuable for helping other retirees navigate medical bureaucracy. Our weekly dinners had become a cherished routine, usually at a local restaurant that specialized in game meats and locally sourced vegetables. These conversations covered everything from construction challenges to family history, filling gaps in my understanding of his life before I was born and his perspective on choices I'd made during my marriage and divorce. One evening in late fall, as we shared elk steaks and discussed the resort's progress, he mentioned that he'd been thinking about my mother more frequently since moving to the mountains. She died when I was in college, too young and too suddenly for any of us to prepare adequately. But something about the mountain environment had triggered memories of camping trips they'd taken before I was born, adventures that had shaped their relationship in ways I'd never fully understood. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos from albums he'd been digitizing, pictures of a young couple hiking trails and setting up tents in locations that looked remarkably similar to where we now lived. My mother looked happy and confident in these images, very different from the tired woman I remembered from my teenage years when work and financial stress had worn down her natural optimism. These photos revealed a side of their relationship that had been overshadowed by the practical challenges of raising a family and building careers in an economic environment that required both parents to work long hours just to maintain middle-class stability. They'd been adventurous once, willing to explore wilderness areas and challenge themselves physically in ways that had stopped when parental responsibilities took priority. My father explained that one of his regrets was allowing practical concerns to completely replace the shared adventures that had originally brought them together. They'd planned to return to hiking and camping once I was grown and established, but cancer had stolen that opportunity before they could reclaim the parts of themselves that had been set aside for responsible adulthood. Listening to him describe those lost plans, I felt a renewed appreciation for the choices I'd made since my divorce. By rebuilding my life in mountain environments, I'd somehow honored aspects of my parents' relationship that I'd never consciously tried to emulate. The connection wasn't planned or calculated, but it felt meaningful in ways that traditional family inheritance couldn't match. That conversation prompted me to examine my own assumptions about work-life balance and long-term planning. The construction industry had taught me to focus on completing current projects successfully, but I'd been less intentional about designing a personal life that could sustain satisfaction over decades rather than just years. I began setting aside time for activities that had nothing to do with professional advancement or financial security. Weekend hiking became a non-negotiable priority rather than something I did when weather and schedules aligned perfectly. I started learning photography, not to document construction progress, but to capture the natural beauty that surrounded my daily work environment. Most importantly, I began considering what kinds of relationships might be worth building in this new phase of my life. For 3 years, I'd been deliberately avoiding romantic entanglements, focusing instead on healing from betrayal and establishing professional credibility in a new location. That isolation had been necessary medicine, but continuing it indefinitely would prevent growth rather than promote it. The resort project was attracting attention from hospitality industry professionals who travel regularly to evaluate new properties and assess their potential for corporate events and luxury travel packages. This created opportunities to meet people whose work involved creativity and service rather than construction and problem solving. One of these professionals was Sarah Mitchell, a corporate event planner from Denver who specialized in mountain retreats for technology companies. She'd visited the site 3 times during construction to evaluate its potential for hosting executive conferences and team-building programs. Our initial conversations were strictly professional, focused on technical specifications and capacity planning. But I found myself looking forward to her visits and extending our discussions beyond the minimum required for her evaluation process. She had an engineer's attention to detail combined with an artist's appreciation for aesthetic beauty, qualities that made her uniquely qualified to understand both the challenges and rewards of building luxury accommodations in remote locations. She was also recently divorced, though her situation had been very different from mine. Her marriage had ended through mutual recognition that they'd grown in incompatible directions, rather than through betrayal or deception. They had separated amicably and continued to co-parent their 10-year-old son with the kind of mature cooperation that I'd once thought was impossible between ex-spouses. Sarah's approach to post-divorce life impressed me with its balance between caution and openness. She dated occasionally but wasn't desperate for a new relationship. She'd built a successful career that provided financial independence and creative satisfaction.
Most importantly, she'd learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between being selective and being afraid. Our professional relationship gradually evolved into personal friendship as the resort neared completion. We began meeting for dinner when she was in town for site visits, conversations that shifted from project specifications to books, travel experiences, and perspectives on mountain living. These interactions felt completely different from the careful dance of early dating or the exhausting emotional labor that had characterized my marriage. Sarah was direct about her interests and boundaries, interested in authentic connection rather than romantic performance. We could discuss challenging topics without either of us feeling threatened or manipulated. When the resort opened to its first guests in early summer, Sarah was hired to coordinate the inaugural corporate retreat, a week-long event for executives from a California-based software company. This gave us an opportunity to work together professionally while exploring whether our personal compatibility could sustain closer proximity and shared responsibilities. The event was flawlessly executed, combining outdoor adventure activities with indoor meeting spaces that showcased the resort's commitment to environmental integration. The guests were impressed with both the facilities and the service, generating exactly the kind of positive publicity that would establish the property's reputation in the competitive luxury hospitality market. More importantly, for my personal life, working closely with Sarah confirmed that we complemented each other professionally and personally. She brought organizational skills and client management expertise that enhanced my technical capabilities. I provided practical problem-solving abilities that supported her creative event planning vision. By the end of that summer, we were spending most of our free time together, either at the resort or exploring hiking trails that neither of us had discovered alone. The relationship developed with the organic pace of 2 people who'd learned to distinguish between chemistry and compatibility, between attraction and genuine partnership. Sarah's son, Tyler, spent 2 weeks with her in Montana that August, providing an opportunity to observe how she balanced single parenthood with career demands and personal relationships. Watching her interact with him revealed qualities that reminded me why I'd wanted children during my marriage, not as extensions of my own ego, but as opportunities to contribute to another person's growth and development. Tyler was curious about construction work and engineering principles, asking detailed questions about how buildings were designed to withstand wind and snow loads in mountain environments. I found myself enjoying these conversations and appreciating his genuine interest in learning about structural systems and safety protocols. More significantly, I discovered that I could care about a child's welfare and development without feeling threatened by parental responsibilities that weren't legally mine. David Chen already had a father who was actively involved in his life. My role, if any, would be supportive rather than primary, which felt sustainable in ways that forced parenthood never could have. When summer ended and Tyler returned to Denver for the school year, Sarah and I began discussing the practical challenges of maintaining a relationship across the distance between Montana and Colorado. Her work required regular travel, but her home base needed to remain near her son's school and his father's residence. The solution emerged naturally from our professional collaboration. The resort's success had generated interest from other developers who wanted to create similar properties in Rocky Mountain locations. I was being recruited for projects in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming that would allow me to work closer to Sarah's home base while continuing to specialize in high-altitude luxury construction. By October, I'd accepted a position managing the construction of a resort complex near Aspen, a project that would keep me in Colorado for at least 2 years while providing challenges that built naturally on my Montana experience. The transition felt like a logical career progression rather than a compromise for personal reasons. Moving back to Colorado also meant closer proximity to my father, who was thriving in his mountain retirement, but appreciated having family nearby as he approached his mid-70s. We resumed our weekly dinners, now with Sarah occasionally joining us for meals that felt like family gatherings rather than obligatory social maintenance. The Aspen project proved even more demanding than the Montana resort, partly because of the location's higher profile and more stringent environmental regulations, but mainly because of the client's expectation that every detail should reflect cutting-edge luxury standards while appearing effortlessly integrated with the natural landscape. Working in that environment attracted attention from architectural magazines and hospitality industry publications, generating the kind of professional recognition that opened doors to increasingly prestigious projects. But more importantly, it confirmed that I'd found work that aligned with my values and interests rather than just providing financial security. Sarah and I found a rhythm that balanced our professional demands with our personal relationship, spending weekends exploring Colorado's wilderness areas and weekdays focused on our respective projects. Tyler visited regularly, gradually becoming comfortable with my presence in his mother's life without feeling threatened or displaced. This carefully constructed stability was tested in an unexpected way during the following spring when I received a call from Maria Santos, my former divorce attorney in Arizona. She was calling to inform me that Stephanie had contacted her office again, this time not about legal matters but about personal ones. Isabella, now 4 years old, had been asking questions about her father that Stephanie was struggling to answer honestly. The child had apparently noticed that other children in her preschool class had fathers who were involved in their daily lives, and she'd begun asking why her father didn't live with them or visit regularly. David Chen had maintained minimal contact with his daughter, providing court-ordered financial support, but showing little interest in developing a meaningful relationship with her. His own children from his first marriage required most of his emotional attention, leaving Isabella feeling like an unwanted complication rather than a cherished daughter. Stephanie was calling to ask whether I would consider meeting with Isabella, not to resume any parental role, but to provide closure for a child who was confused about her family structure. She wanted Isabella to understand that there were good men in the world who could be trusted, even if her biological father wasn't interested in being one of them.
The request surprised me because it seemed to acknowledge realities that Stephanie had spent years denying. She was finally accepting that David Chen wouldn't become the involved father that Isabella deserved, and she was looking for ways to provide her daughter with positive male role models who could demonstrate healthy relationship principles.
I discussed the situation with Sarah, who brought perspective from her own experience with co-parenting and blended family dynamics. She pointed out that meeting with Isabella could provide benefits for the child without creating obligations or complications for me, as long as boundaries were clearly established and maintained. After careful consideration, I agreed to a single meeting in a neutral location, with clear understanding that this wouldn't establish ongoing contact or future obligations. The goal was simply to give Isabella an opportunity to ask questions and receive honest answers about why some adults make choices that affect children in ways the children don't understand or deserve. The meeting took place at a children's museum in Phoenix, with Stephanie present but not directing the conversation. Isabella was a bright, articulate child who asked direct questions about why I wasn't her father and whether that meant there was something wrong with her that made fathers not want to stay. Answering those questions required careful balance between honesty and age-appropriate explanation. I told her that families come in many different forms, that some children live with both biological parents, while others live in different arrangements that can be equally loving and stable. I emphasized that children are never responsible for adult decisions, and that her worth as a person wasn't determined by other people's choices about involvement in her life. Most importantly, I wanted her to understand that she deserved to be surrounded by people who chose to love and support her, regardless of biological relationships or legal obligations. Family, I explained, was created through daily choices to care for each other, rather than through genetics or marriage certificates. The conversation lasted less than an hour, but it seemed to provide Isabella with the reassurance she'd been seeking. She thanked me for explaining things in ways that made sense, and gave me a drawing she'd made of mountains, which she said reminded her that some things were strong enough to last forever. Driving back to Colorado after that meeting, I felt a complex mixture of sadness for Isabella's situation and gratitude for the life I'd built since walking away from the legal and emotional chaos that had surrounded her birth. The contrast between my current stability and the ongoing dysfunction of Stephanie's choices was stark enough to confirm that I'd made the right decisions at every crucial juncture. That evening, Sarah and I sat on the deck of my cabin, watching sunset paint the peaks in colors that changed minute by minute, discussing the day's events and their implications for our own relationship and future plans. She understood my need to provide closure for a confused child while maintaining boundaries that protected the life we were building together. Our conversation evolved into broader discussion about family structures, parental responsibilities, and the importance of choosing partners who shared fundamental values about honesty, commitment, and mutual respect. We both brought experience from failed marriages, but we'd learned different lessons that complemented rather than conflicted with each other. By the time stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, we'd reached understanding about our own future that felt both realistic and hopeful. We would continue building our relationship with the same careful attention to foundation and structure that characterized our professional work, taking time to ensure that each decision supported long-term stability rather than short-term convenience. 6 months later, Sarah accepted my proposal on a hiking trail that overlooked the valley where we'd first worked together. The engagement ring was simple and elegant, chosen for beauty rather than size, reflecting values we shared about substance over appearance. Our wedding was planned for the following summer, a small ceremony for family and close friends in a mountain location that had become meaningful to both of us. Standing in that valley, holding the hand of a woman who understood both my professional passion and my personal history, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment of genuine happiness and authentic partnership. The betrayal that had once threatened to define my future had instead become the catalyst for rebuilding my life on principles that could sustain lasting satisfaction. The mountains remained unchanged, eternal witnesses to human struggles and triumphs that were temporary compared to geological time, but permanently meaningful to those who experienced them. I'd learned to find peace in that perspective, understanding that personal happiness came through building something solid and beautiful, rather than through avoiding all possibility of loss or disappointment. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, planning details for our future together, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by choosing construction over destruction, growth over resentment, and possibilities over grievances. The foundation was solid now, built on bedrock that could support whatever storms might come, strong enough to last and beautiful enough to enjoy.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.